Good morning. And today we're going a little bit west from Newcastle. We're in just outside Newburn. We're going to talk about the Bishop Wars and what probably was the start of the civil wars of England. So let's begin. As we stand on the banks of the River Tyne, imagine back in August 1640, there was a ragtag English army staring across the waterhouse where I am standing now. And there was a determined Scottish force here. I didn't know it yet, but this riverside standoff would be more than just settle a border dispute. It would expose the fatal weakness of the king, help back up his government, and set the stage for a bloody civil war that would change Britain forever. This wasn't just another battle, it was the spark that lit a very long fuse. Yeah, I remember back then, King Charles I was not only King of England, he was King of Scotland and King of Ireland. And it was his armies that were facing up against each other. To get it, we'll need to rewind and look at the clashes of religions and powers that had simmered for years. Charles wasn't just King England, he also ruled Scotland and Ireland, but they weren't one happy unified kingdom. They were separated realms with their own distinct religious identities. The problem was Charles had a vision for a single unified church across all his territories, and he wanted to model it on the High Anglican Church of England, run by the bishops he appointed. This went down in Scotland about as well as you'd expect. The King's plan wasn't just about prayer books, it was a direct attack on their spiritual and natural independence in their eyes. The king was head of state, but only Christ could be king of the kirk, their church, which was governed by its own councils and not by royal appointees. In 1637, Charles pushed too hard to try and force a new prayer book on Scotland. The backlash was instant and surprisingly organised. A year later, Scottish nobles, ministers and commoners started signing the National Covenant, a document pleading to resist the king's religious changes. These Covenanters effectively became a rebel government. Charles saw this as a flat-out insurrection and launched the First Bishops' Wars in 1639. He had been ruling England for over a decade without Parliament, a period known as his personal rule. Without them, he simply couldn't raise the cash for a proper war. The first conflict ended in a humiliating truce at Berwick without a single major battle. But it solved nothing. Charles wouldn't concede and the Covenanters wouldn't back down. The stage was set for round two. Learning the lessons from the First War, the Scots decided to go on the offensive, and in 1640 the Covenant-led Scottish government, meeting without the king's permission, authorised a professional army. For their commanders they chose Alexander Leslie, a brilliant and battle-hardened Scottish general who had served as a field marshal in Europe's brutal 30-year war. Under his leadership, a well-drilled, highly motivated army of about 20,000 men was ready to march. And on the 20th of August 1640, Leslie's army crossed the River Tweed into England. Their goal wasn't just a random plunder, it was strategic genius. They bypassed the fortified town of Berwick and made a beeline for Newcastle. Why Newcastle? Because it was the heart of the coal trade, the main fuel source for the massive growing city of London. By taking Newcastle, the Scots could essentially hold London's economy hostage and force King Charles to finally listen to their demands. Meanwhile, on the English side, things were a mess. Charles had tried to call Parliament in April 1640 to get money for his war, but the short Parliament was dissolved after just 3 weeks when its members insisted on airing their own grievances first, forcing to rely on loans and his own limited funds. The army Charles scraped together was a pale shadow of Leslie's forces. It made up of largely unenthusiastic militia who were poorly equipped and sometimes mutinous. The English commander in the north, Lord Conway, was in an impossible position. He had only about 5,000 men to face Leslie's 20,000. His troops were a mix of poorly trained infantry and cavalry, some of whom were so undisciplined they caused riots on the march north. Conway knew he was hopelessly outgunned. His boss, the Earl of Strafford, the king's top adviser, waved off his concerns from the safety of London, convincing the Scots were bluffing. By the time they realised they weren't, the Scottish army were already closing in on Newcastle. Leslie, seeing the city's defences on the north side were stronger, decided to go slightly west and cross the Tyne and hit from the south. His crossing place was at Newburn Ford. I think crossing the ford was roughly where Newburn Bridge is now. Conway had no choice but to react. He rushed his small forces to Newburn to block the crossing on the lower flat fields on the south bank of the Tyne. His men frantically started digging in, creating small earthen forts to defend the ford. It was a terrible defensive position. The south bank was completely exposed, overlooking by the higher ground of the north side, where the Scots were setting up camp. As the English dug in on August the 27th, they could see Leslie's army taking up command positions on the hill opposite them. The trap was about to be sprung. On the morning of the battle, the two armies faced each other across, waiting for the high tide to recede. Leslie made a formal, almost theatrical request to pass so he could deliver a petition to the king. Conway, of course, refused. The tension was thick, enough to cut with a sword. The Scots commanders had used the night wisely. The artillery chief, Alexander Hamilton, had placed his cannons perfectly on high ground of Headon Law, giving them a clear line of fire down on the exposed English trenches. The English earthworks, built in a hurry, offered almost little to no real protection. Around 1 in the afternoon the battle began, supposedly after a Scottish officer got too close to the ford and was picked off by an English musketeer. After a brief exchange of musket fire, the Scottish artillery opened up. The bombardment was devastating. Cannonballs tore through the flimsy English defences, ripping through the ranks of terrified infantry. An English officer later wrote of the great losses and such confusion that caused his men to abandon their post under relentless fire. The raw English recruits broke. They abandoned their positions and their guns and fleeing in a full-blown panic. The English army fled Newburn and didn't stop running. They abandoned Newcastle entirely, and 2 days later Leslie's army marched into the city unopposed. They now had their hands on London's coal supply. For King Charles, the news was a political and military catastrophe. His authority was in tatters. His army had been humbled and his treasury was empty. He had no money, no army, and no way to fight back. He had to negotiate. The defeat forced Charles to sign the Treaty of Ripon in October 1640. The terms were humiliating. The Scottish army would continue to occupy Northumberland and Durham, and the English government would have to pay them £850 a day for the troubles until final peace was settled. around a monument commemorating the battle. This is notice boards telling you about it. And to get the huge sum of money needed to pay the Scots, Charles was finally forced to do one thing that he had avoided for 11 years, and that was recalling Parliament. In November 1640, the Long Parliament met for the first time, and it wouldn't be dismissed for nearly 20 years. The Parliament was filled with men who now had the leverage control of the kingdom's finances. The defeat at Newburn directly empowered the king's opponents. They systematically took apart the tools of his personal rule, arrested his key advisors like Earl Strafford, and passed laws to secure their own power. While it wasn't the only cause, the Irish Rebellion of 1641 would add much more fuel to the fire. The chain of events that led to the English Civil War in 1642 began here, at a small ford on the River Tyne. The battle had proven the king could be beaten. As a look around tells you, a look around the boards tell you exactly what to do. And at the time there's the cannons and pikes, long spears and cavalry. And there you can see the plan of the battle with Scottish on the top and English on the bottom. And the ford was just a way back down near where the bridge is now. So if you appreciate the detailed looks and causes and consequences of Britain's forgotten battles, make sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that like, and hit that notification bell for more videos like this. And we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.